Dr. Emily Nusbaum. I'm a postdoctoral research associate here at Yale University in the Center for Emotional Intelligence. I'm going to talk to you guys a little bit about something different today. So I study humor, and humor has a lot of meanings. You can talk about humor as in like a sense of humor, so what people find funny. You can talk about it as in like how people perceive humor, whether they notice it in their everyday lives. Humor can mean how you use humor. So is it a coping mechanism for you in times of stress, or is it sort of a social lubricant when you're at a party and don't know anybody? And then finally, you can talk about humor in terms of who is good at producing humor and coming up with something funny on the spot. And that's really what I study, how people produce funny stuff. And so there's not a whole lot of work out there in this area. My interest in humor really developed from my background in creativity research. And the way that you measure creativity, I'm sure you guys have heard before, is with divergent thinking tasks, where you ask people to come up with unusual uses for an everyday object, like a brick or a rope or a cardboard box, something like that. And then you score those unusual uses for how creative they are. And after years and years of scoring tens of thousands of these responses, I started to notice that a lot of the most creative responses were also really quite funny. So for example, one person once wrote that you could hollow out a brick and use it as a Barbie coffin, which was really a pretty silly example of something unusual that you could do with a brick. So I started to think that, creativity and humor, they're probably somewhat related. So I went to the literature and found there really wasn't much out there, and decided, well, I want to know how people come up with funny stuff. So I started from essentially the very beginning. And I started looking at who's good at being funny and sort of taking it in the direction of how they do it. So like I said, there's not much out there. So the first thing that we really had to do was come up with a few different humor tasks and see how they were performing in relation to older humor tasks that people have used in the past. The classic one, for example, that we use to measure humor is give people a cartoon like something you'd see in the New Yorker, just a single pane cartoon, and ask them to write a funny cartoon caption for it. And then you rate those for how funny they are, quite like we do in the creativity research. And so we found with these types of assessments that there's certainly a personality profile for who's good at being funny. And it's not what you might expect. So when you ask people to think about who's good at being funny, the typical thing we think of initially is like, the class clown, the person who's always running the group, someone who's always, the middle of all the entertainment and wants to just have the spotlight on them and is always trying to be sort of silly and funny and keep the group entertained. But in my research, that's really not what I found. I found that, in fact, funny people, when you think about it a little bit more, tend to be the sort of quiet person who just unleashes a zinger every once in a while. And so they're not really so extroverted. So in a meta-analysis I did on all the literature on humor and personality, I found that people who are good at being funny are people who are high in openness to experience. So they're kind of quirky, they're pretty intellectual, they're good at being creative, and they're not so, the key is, they're not so extroverted. So extroversion really has nothing to do with humor ability, or the ability to produce humor, at least the research shows so far. It's really being high in openness to experience.